Hi folks, Dr. Pulsifer here, and I'm going to talk about combat strength in modern warfare, which is far more machines than manpower. And of course, I'm going to talk about this in light of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the ensuing war. So I'll start out talking about Russia, and then I hope more generally about the greater importance of machines in modern warfare, especially about how more men on their own doesn't increase combat power much compared to older days. So Russia has a war problem. The Ukrainians outfight them. Sanctions limit Russian weapon production. How can they succeed in the long run? They're relying now on general winter, quote unquote, trying to freeze out the Ukrainians so that the Ukrainians will quit the war. And by freeze, I mean temperature, of course. But by now, the Ukrainians must hate Russia. Russia has, in a sense, created the modern nation of Ukraine in this war. And the Ukrainians will probably hate Russia for a century. History shows that attacking civilians almost never wins a war as well. It didn't cause the Japanese to quit, despite firebombing Tokyo, which was just as bad as the nuclear attacks. It didn't cause the Germans to quit when we firebombed Dresden and slaughtered vast numbers of people. It didn't stop the English when the Germans created the Blitz, the air war. It almost never works. It just makes people more determined. While the Russians wait for General Winter, and as their hope if General Winter fails, they rely on sending more men to the front, even though those men are usually very poorly trained and equipped and motivated. In other words, they're cannon fodder. Now, in warfare ages ago, calling up a whole lot of untrained troops still wouldn't help you a great deal. You can think of the FERD and levies and so on. If you don't train the troops, they're just likely to run away or just likely to be killed. Now, of course, warfare is much more complicated and it doesn't work. You need weapons, and you need big weapons. And Russia's military production, in fact, any nation's military production today, is quite slow in peacetime. Sanctions and manpower shortages have crippled what's left. And by manpower shortages in production, I mean you have all the people taken for the partial mobilization, plus all the people who fled the mobilization. Perhaps as much as 1 million men are gone from the employment pool, and that's hard to make up. Normally in wartime you ramp up, and of course in World War II, for example, that meant a lot of women moved into the workforce, but Russia has pretended it's not a war. Their industry was not in good shape to start with. The sanctions make for parts shortages. Russian production of cars has plummeted because they can't get parts. They had a lot of weapons in storage, but those have proved to be inoperable most of the time owing to corruption. They weren't taken care of, and sheer age. So it's a grim looking situation. Where does Russia get more and better tanks, artillery, drones, missiles? Given economic sanctions, they don't, although Iran is trying to supply. They don't even have rifles and clothing for new recruits, not even decent food, although they're getting some stuff from China. Moreover, Russia is confusing number of men, even if untrained, with military manpower. And as I'm trying to make a point here, machines are much more important. Cannon fodder is just that, poor slobs who won't win anything but a grave. So we look at the trends of history and we begin with men as the core of armies and end with machines at least as important as men. And especially at sea and in the air, machines are much more important than the men, although if you have good men, the machines will operate better. It doesn't matter how many men you've got in, say, a World War II context. if one side has 10 battleships and the other side has none. Or if one side has 1,000 fighter planes and the other side has 100. Though the quality of the machines is very important there. So I don't want to minimize the importance of well-trained, motivated soldiers as the Ukrainians, but in a 21st century big war, machines are becoming more and more important. Even in World War II land warfare, artillery and explosions in general, mortars, mines, even booby traps, killed far more people than bullets. The bullets may have been like 10%. And a vast number of bullets had to be expended for one kill. By vast number, I mean thousands. Tanks and armored vehicles are still important, despite the man-portable tank killers in flattish terrain like Ukraine. But it has been an artillery war. And I suspect that a very great part of the casualties have been caused by artillery. The long-range missiles, of course, are a form of artillery, but they're far more important than traditional artillery and even than airplanes. Think about the cruiser Moskva, which was sunk by missile, and the Russian infrastructure assault on Ukraine, which is all missiles. Drones are increasingly important, of course, for artillery spotting more than attacking on their own, although the Iranian attack suicide drones have had success. Satellite images are available publicly, but both sides have access to military images, and yet the drones give real-time images that you can't get from satellite. We now see many unmanned machines participating in combat. Drones are controlled from a distance, missiles aren't manned, reconnaissance, attack. There are even boats, as well as planes and copters, that are unmanned machines that can cause a great deal of damage or make a great deal of difference. There are also some autonomous unmanned machines. You could look at some kinds of guided missiles which can steer away from enemy attacks as making their own decisions. And there are tracked vehicles for casualty removal, mine clearing, and even combat. These are just coming into play. Now, traditional Russian military doctrine for centuries has relied on outnumbering the enemy and on artillery. In this war, they tried to rely only on contract troops, not outnumbering the Ukrainians, but that didn't work. They didn't expect the Ukrainians to fight. They thought there'd be a lot of people who would help the Russians out. Of course, they never expected to be in a prolonged fight. They expected it to be over in 3-4 days. So then they turned to artillery, which they have a lot of, but it's old, it's poorly maintained, they don't have infinite ammunition, and their barrels are wearing out. For all artillery, rifled artillery, there's a spiral in there that's the rifling, and it wears out. And then you need to replace the barrel or do something to restore that rifling, but usually you replace the barrel or the inside of the barrel. Well, that's not happening. And so the artillery becomes less and less accurate. So they're relying on artillery, but their artillery is not working very well. And they have serious logistical problems. Not only is the ammunition running out, despite getting some from Belarus and perhaps North Korea, the ammo can't get to the artillery because of supply line problems. Ukraine focuses on that, blowing up ammo dumps and bridges, cutting off roads with artillery fire and even rockets. Russia retreated from the Kherson pocket because they couldn't get enough supplies over the Dnipro River to that region. They were mostly succeeding in holding off the Ukrainians, who weren't really trying to break through. They were just trying to wear them down. But they couldn't stay because they couldn't get enough supplies. The Kerch Bridge explosion was a big problem because a lot of the supplies that would have gone in Kherson would have come across the Kerch Bridge to start with. This is partly a logistical war, just as all wars are really, and Russia is losing badly. Well, the lesson here is that money talks. Where machines dominate, money dominates. Actual money and the productive power that comes from money and costs money. Russia doesn't have much money, especially as their energy exports are increasingly throttled. Ukraine gets money and equipment and training from the West. The West can give military aid, sometimes old equipment they no longer need, so it costs them very little, but it's very valuable to the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians would love to have Abrams tanks, but for some reason the United States won't give them old ones that are in storage. Russia has no such donors other than Belarus. So if not for their nukes, the Russians would already be beaten by a more modern army, as the West would give them those Abrams tanks and F-16s and so on, but they're not giving them to the Ukrainians because they don't want to provoke the Russians too far. So if not for Russian nukes, the war would be over, if it had ever started. Thanks for listening.